Redhead Whiskey here, and it's a very big privilege and honor for me to interview one of the most honorable and distinguished and revered voices in the whiskey industry, Mr. Charles MacLean.
Hi, I mean, so it's an honor for me as well.
Thank you. And so, Mr. MacLean, very briefly, because you have a very long history in the history of whiskey and a lot of significant contribution, authored many, many books, and have participated, designed, documented, researched, and taught whiskey for over 40 years. You have received numerous awards, including Keeper of the Quake and Master of the Quake, and an MBE from Her Majesty, Late Majesty, the Queen. So many contributions to the whiskey industry. So great pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, I have all of your books. Your Wikipedia was my guide as I started deep diving into the world of whiskey, and it's signed by you, and I'm looking forward to meeting you again to sign the current read. That you've been writing about whiskey for over a decade. So how has the whiskey industry evolved during your career in terms of consumers' preferences for flavors and production methods?
Well, as you rightly say, Aline, I started writing about whiskey in 1981. Sorry about my voice, I've got laryngitis at the moment. Originally, during the 80s, I did a lot of work for commercial work, writing brochures and things like that for whiskey companies and for brands. Now, the 1980s were a very, very difficult time for the Scotch whiskey industry. It was Scotch whiskey industry in particular, but whiskey generally. There'd been a change in fashion, but the most important thing was that in the decade before, really in the 2 decades before, post Second World War, whiskey was phenomenally successful. Very, very popular. It was the drink of the free world. And as you know, the whiskey made is anticipating demand in years to come, because it doesn't even become whiskey until it's been matured for at least 3 years. So during the 1970s, there was a huge growth in production output in anticipation of demand. Now, this was all very well, but the bubble burst, really. There were 2 features of it. The end of the Vietnam War, which had stimulated the American market for Scotch. And the American market by this time was the most important, overseas, most important market in the world. And then the second thing was the oil crisis, which hiked the oil price globally. So there was a global recession in effect. And linked to that was a change in fashion towards the end of the 1970s, where the younger drinkers in particular were moving away from brown spirits and favoring white rum, particularly Bacardi, and vodka. There was also growth in the UK, more wine because of our connection with the European community. More wine whiskey became heavily taxed compared with wine. So change in fashion. Now, it was impossible for the Scotch whisky industry to have anticipated that, but by the early 1980s, frankly, the industry was in crisis. There was much more whiskey produced and under bond than there was demand. So that led in 1983 and 1985 to substantial closures of distilleries. Now, in those days, pretty well all the whiskey was blended whiskey. Johnny Walker, J&B, Bell's, White Horse, etc. And and all the malt whiskey made went, except for a tiny fraction, went into blends. The most significant thing in that period, the 1980s and indeed into the 1990s, was the growth in interest in malt whiskey, single malt whiskey.
Mhm.
And if you like, that kind of saved the day, because it wasn't perceived, it was perceived as being a very fashionable drink. And it wasn't exactly like blended Scotch. So it had cachet. Now, the first company to start promoting the single malt was the original whiskey, if you like, and but the first company to start promoting it was William Grant and Sons with Glenfiddich.
Mhm.
They started to promote Glenfiddich in 1963, so quite a bit before. The rest of the industry sat on its hands and said, "Well, who on earth wants to drink single malt whiskey?" You know, we the whole of our history, so well, certainly since the 1880s, had been based on blended Scotch. But then they began to realize that Glenfiddich started to do terribly well, and so some of the independent companies. When I say that, I mean the biggest producer was the Distillers Company Limited, which is now Diageo, and the Diageo looked on with amazement. Some of the independents started to promote their own malts
Mhm.
with considerable success. Now, after this crisis in the early 80s, more and more began to realize that perhaps they couldn't find a market for their what was called filling orders. You know, the gearing of all malt whiskey distilleries was related to orders from blenders. The blenders were the customers, and then they then realized that there was a market for single malt whiskey,
Mhm.
and that saved the day. By about by about 1990, single malt whiskey was taking off all over the place, and
Mhm.
more and more was made available. More brands were made available. Um, so that was the most significant thing. Now, I was commissioned to my first book was commissioned in 1988, and that was about that was I've got a copy of it here. A little, a little. Can you see that? It's a
Oh,
small book called the Pocket Guide
I
uh,
don't have that one. I must get it now.
Scotch. You probably can't find
I have a different version of it. Yeah.
it's very out of date. You might find it on Abe Books or something like that. So that was both. It's like like a little encyclopedia of brands, both blended Scotch and single malt whiskey. And then that was followed. Well, that got me started on. I'd been writing books before, um, on if you like Scottish non-fiction subjects, historical mainly,
Hmm.
or published during the 1980s. But that got me onto whiskey seriously, and the because I'd done an awful lot of work in the 80s, as I say, for various whiskey companies and brands, and had become very interested in the subject. And so that little book, and then following on from that, there were other books, and then one which was a big book about malt whiskey, it was just called Malt
Yeah.
Whiskey, and
Hmm.
the and that was really a turning point. So after that, well, let's go back to your original question. So the during these years, there we are, malt whiskey. Yeah, good for you. Um, um, but during this period, we saw the rise in malt whiskey, and that malt whiskey book, which won prizes, was quite significant. It made a significant contribution um, to the interest in malt whiskey.
Yeah. So in that process, is it industry trends or history or consumer flavors that are driving um, driving the consumption, the movement between blends and single malts. And, we'll talk a little bit later about what's the upcoming trends, but who's driving that the trend, the
Well,
bus?
it was really consumer demand. The and that also was led by course, there wasn't the internet or anything like that, social media in those days, but the you know, the number of articles and features in magazines and so on, standard ones, because there were the only dedicated whiskey magazine was in Italy, would you believe, at that time, and that was a short-lived venture, but but it was really driven by consumer demand. Now, so why did the consumers? Well, I think they began to realize that whiskey is acknowledged to be the most complex of all spirits. And malt whiskey in particular, blended Scotch, of course, is a combination of many malt whiskies with a proportion of grain whiskey. And but the job of I'm currently writing a book about blended Scotch whiskey, but the job of the blender really is to combine all these flavors in such a way that they don't become they always say of blended Scotch that it's more than the sum of its parts. It's like a gestalt. And now what consumers were looking for at that time were more distinctive flavors. And significantly in 1988, 1989, the company which became Diageo, it was then called United Distillers, they released a series called the Classic Malts, 6 different whiskies from 6 different regions of Scotland, each with a distinct flavor profile. Now that did an awful lot of work, a lot of good in terms of educating the consumer, making them realize that each malt whiskey was different. And so the malt whiskey drinkers, generally speaking, look for quality. You know, they're not necessarily brand loyal. Blended Scotch drinkers tend to be brand loyal, but the malt whiskey drinkers are not. And it really opened up the idea, or educated, if you like. And so in bars, in liquor stores, people they began to stock a range of malt whiskies, each of them having a distinct flavor profile. And then the brand owners, the distillers themselves, began to release the same whiskey at different years, for example, and then increasingly different finishes and so on. So offering a broader range of expressions, as we call it. So obviously, for anything to become popular, it's got to be available. And so increasingly, malt whiskey became increasingly available. So it's a combination of the two, that it was really popular demand, consumer demand, that drove this. And then the industry seized the opportunity, supported by the press and by publishers. I mean, there were really very few books about whiskey around in the late 1980s, and but then there followed a torrent of books, publications, and by the late 90s, so increasing interest in whiskey. Now these are the most significant changes in the 80s and 90s, but really consumer driven, and then picked up by the producers, by the brand owners.
So you have authored many books and guides on and have defined the wheel of tasting and the sensory experience. So you have defined that process, and you have gone through it for many years. When you approach writing a new book or evaluating whiskey, do you still approach it the same way? And what is the process, and how has it evolved over the time?
Well, I was fortunate enough to be invited on a week-long course, it was a company called the Pentland Scotch Whisky. It's now the Scotch Whisky Research Institute. And there was only 6 of us on the course. They were all industry professionals, distillery managers or whatever. This was in 1992, and that changed my life. Absolutely changed my life.
Wow.
The title of the course was the sensory evaluation of potable spirits, and so this revealed how professionals, blenders, and people like that go about assessing whiskey. And I've used that procedure, obviously, ever since. I do a lot of assessment, daily almost for various. Are being asked to comment on various whiskies, and well, as an aside, it has to be done. Sensory evaluation has to be done in the morning before lunch, and if I'm writing detailed tasting notes, really I can only look at two max, because your system, your senses become blunted. More. I mean, if I'm judging a competition, I can romp through a dozen or so, no problem at all. Just a yes, no, and or just give it a score, whatever. I never ever go public on scores, by the way. I privately score, and if I'm chairing a panel, I ask the panel to score. But I think it's invidious to go, because I know how much effort goes into making that product, and the performance. Well, let's get a dram in my glass. I don't have the right glass. Most of the work is called sensory evaluation.
Can I bring a glass and join you?
Yeah, and let me nip out and great.
I have with me the Glencairn and the perfect
excellent. Yes, and I've got a spirits nosing glass and a Glencairn.
I'm not so, and I'm pouring a Hazelbird that I got.
Oh, right.
I am ready for you.
Right.
Okay.
It's called sensory evaluation because rather than just whiskey tasting, because in truth you use all your senses. You use sight to look at the color of the whiskey in the bottle or in the glass.
In the bottle.
You look at sight. The only missing sense is sound, but we can come to that in a second. Sight, smell. And smell is the most important for evaluating. Taste, touch is exemplified by mouthfeel, the texture in the mouth, and also by nose feel, or rather
I don't mind doing this too, just to feel the oiliness. Or
it's quite interesting to feel the slipperiness of new make spirit, for example, and sound doesn't really come into it, although I like to think that if you the sound of the bottle being opened, and especially if it goes which means it's a full bottle, that's very comforting sound. But discount that. But because of the primacy of smell in evaluation, it is essential to have a glass which delivers the aroma to best effect. Now, and we're talking about appreciation and assessment, not about enjoyment here.
Correct. Yes.
A standard whiskey glass, and this is rather a posh one, but is great for drinking. And it's an old-fashioned glass, in truth, and it's great for ice and for mixers and and that's ideal for just enjoyment. And when I'm just enjoying whiskey, I'll just use one of those glasses. But for assessment and appreciation, because of the importance of the nose, it is essential to have you've got one in your hand, and I've got one in mine. This is called a spirits nosing glass, and it's like a sherry copita, because as is yours, and it narrows at the top, and so you can So it directs the aroma, it gathers the aroma and directs it up your nose. Now, increasingly commonly, the Glencairn glass, which I know you've got one as well, it's more robust and it does the same job, but you'll see that it narrows at the top. The Glencairn glass is terrific because it can go into the washing machine and so on, and a dishwasher, and a bowl, so you can swirl it, and that again releases the aroma.
Is it recommended to swirl whiskey just as
Yes,
wine?
very much so. I certainly do. Some would say no, and I know that some wine buffs would say no, but I think it is essential, and indeed most all the blenders that I know will swirl, and sometimes fairly vigorously, and sometimes warm it in the hands, so it helps to warm it up a time. Don't add ice. Ice, it closes the aroma. For drinking, for enjoyment, great. Not for assessment. You want it to settle in the glass and to warm up a little tiny bit. Yeah. Well, I mean, but in the hot summers, the ice is very nice. There is no. Yep, there we are. So you can run through. There's no fixed language for describing whiskey. We can talk about this forever, but there are a clutch of, if you like, primary aromatic groups. They might be cereal, they might be fruity, they might be floral, they might be peaty, smoky, they might be winey, they might be woody. Let's say that they're the most simple. And so if you run through, when you're nosing the whiskey, you can ask yourself, now, am I getting any cereal notes? Which may be anything from, breakfast cereals to, porridge and cooked mash, chicken feed, any cereal notes, well, and then when you go to the next one would be fruity, let's say, and you say that of that hazelburn, that it's got a slightly fruity characteristic. Then ask yourself, what am I looking at here? Am I looking at fresh fruit, dried fruits, fruit,
fresh white peach?
Well, that's very good. Yes, because then you can narrow it down and say, well, yeah, so I'm on dried fruit. So am I looking at sultanas or raisins or dried figs, or dried peach, dried bananas even.
Oh yeah, very much so.
Do you know what I mean? And then floral. Excuse me, floral. Floral's a difficult one for me, I must say. It's much more delicate. But some whiskies are distinctly floral, or lightly floral, and then you'd say is it carnations or roses or wallflowers or what, or even just green. There is an accepted descriptor which is just simply green, which doesn't really say very much, but it's commonly used. And of course, when you get into the phenolic, the smoky, oblique medicinal, they're much more obvious, and they do break down into really smoky, peaty, smoky, or medicinal iodine, aromas, and and again you can tweak it by thinking, well, yeah, I'm smelling something slightly smoky. Now, is it a burning bonfire? Is it a smolder? I often think of it as a distant bonfire, which is not, it's not smoke in your face. It's smoldering, and sometimes smoky displays itself as peat itself, the turf, really doesn't have much smell, but you can imagine the smell before it's burning,
Yeah. That's such nuances that. Yeah. How do you train your nose to be so wide and in those descriptions? Do you still train it today?
No, as you can imagine, I'm often asked, hey, you must have the best job in the world, but how do you get a job like that? I see. Practice.
How do you
Drink.
practice? Yeah, apart from, I
Well, you
mean,
don't really. I'm sorry, I've got a cold as well as my
no,
lung.
I don't want to. If you feel that you want to take a break, then that's
No,
okay
no,
too.
no, 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 no problem at all. The um, we're all men and women, young and old, um, are similarly equipped physiologically to assess nose, and particularly nose and taste. Now, obviously, you shouldn't, before you're doing an assessment, you shouldn't eat a curry or I mean, that's why I do my assessments in the morning, but I have a very light breakfast, if anything. But but in terms of training, it really is just a matter of experience, really, just sort of nosing and constantly thinking. This is what I learned in 1992. The smell everything. Be aware of smells. You know, I mean, after that course, you know, when I would open the bin and smell, you know, just sort of you know, baked bean tins, banana skins, you know, all the stuff in the garbage.
Hmm.
Be aware of smells. So it's hugely rewarding, actually, because, you know, even if you're stuck in some ghastly airport, you know, you can, and you've got without a book, and you know, you can certainly sit there and smell, you know, and it gives you it gives you something to do.
Do you
It's
document these? Do you write it down, or do you just make
no,
sure
no,
to?
no, no. Obviously, when I'm assessing, I concentrate hard, and and write it down. Now, another important thing actually is that this is no tasting note is set in stone. You know, what you might smell might be different from what I might smell, subtly different. And indeed, what I might smell might vary from day to day. So there's no, I mean, generally speaking, it should be similar. You know, I like to, if I'm writing a detailed tasting note, I like to go back and look at it at the end of the day, 6 o'clock-ish, and to revise or adjust the tasting note, or indeed to look at it on another day. But it's very important there is no fundamental tasting note. There's no because you know the we react, humans. A lot of it is to do with mood and company. That's essential. The enjoyment, particularly, is to do with you know, where you taste it, with whom, and um, but anyway, so I mean, really, the tasting notes are really a guide. You know, I try to be as honest as I can, and um, when I'm writing notes, indeed, you know, sometimes people, you know, some of the big companies send me samples to assess, and I'll report. Well, I'll do what I can. I usually become coldly analytical when you know, I really don't like it terribly much. You know, and I can be enthusiastic when interesting enough, you know, you can be most enthusiastic when it reminds you of something.
Mm.
So, you know, you smell something, and they're very often memories of childhood. You know, it takes you back to some sort of sweeties, candies that you had enjoyed
Mhm.
as a child,
Mhm.
or situations. You know, your Christmas at your grandmother's house, or
Yeah.
the smell of your grandfather's motor car, or whatever. You know, and I've chaired panels where people have the tears have come to their eyes because they're reminded so vividly. Smell is the most vivid of, you know, recollections, and that's because the part of the brain that identifies smells, it's called the olfactory epithelium, but it's situated in a part of the brain called the limbic system, which is the most primitive part of our brains. Indeed, it's so primitive that it formed when we were still reptiles, before we were mammals. Unbelievable. And it's, as well as smell, it's the seat of long-term memory and emotion. And so the three are closely related. Hence the fact that a smell can bring back a childhood memory, and indeed it can be very emotional.
Evoke
Now,
emotion.
by any means, not by any means does every whiskey trigger these reactions, but they can do. Some can do, and of course, if you get that sort of reaction, I mean, it enhances your appreciation massively. If it brings a vision, an image to your mind. Gosh, I could go on for that.
Yeah. So, Mr. MacLean, we are the recording is about to end in 2 minutes, and I'm sensitive to your time. Would that be okay for?
I don't worry, I can go on forever, but I mean, it's entirely up to you.
Me too. So, can I send you another link for 2 more questions? Is that okay?
Absolutely, no problem.
So I will pause this one and no, I don't want to leave the meeting because cancel, stop recording.